The Rebbe starts off the Sicha by saying that we discussed many times about the absolute accuracy of Lashon Rashi ala Torah. Not only the words of his Pirush, but also the words of the Pasuk that he quotes before the beginning of his Pirush, that which we know as a Dibur HaMaschil. Says the Rebbe, according to this, what needs clarification is in a Rashi in our Parsha. In the beginning of the Parsha of the Moyados of the Yomim Tovim, after the general introduction that Vayedaber, Hashem tells Moshe Rabbeinu to speak to the Bnei Yisrael about Moyadei Hashem, about the festivals of Hashem. Eilehe Moyadei, these are my appointed times. The pasuk says, Sheishes Yomim Teyasa Malacha, 6 days work shall be done. Uvayoyim Hashvi, and on the 7th day, Shabbos in Mikra Kodesh, Kol Malacha Loisasu, you're not allowed to do work on the holy day of Shabbos. Then the Torah continues afterwards with the psukim, Eile Moyadei Hashem. These are the festivals, these are the appointed times of Hashem, enumerating all the different Yomim Tovim. From this pasuk, Rashi quotes the words Sheishes Yomim and explains and says, Ma inyan Shabbos eitzel moyados. Why is Shabbos mentioned together with Yomim Tovim? L'lametcha, to teach you that if someone desecrates Yom Tov, it's as if he desecrated Shabbos. And someone that keeps Yomim Tovim, it's as if he kept the Shabbosim. So the Rebbe asks, the question in our pasuk was, as Rashi himself says, Ma inyan Shabbos eitzel moyados. What has Shabbos to do with Yom Tov? According to this, what should have been the words that Rashi would have been quoting from the pasuk? Bayoyim hashvi Shabbos, that on the 7th day is Shabbos. And only those words, because that's what he's asking on. What is Shabbos doing over here? Instead of that, he brings the first words, Sheishes Yomim, whereas the words Uvayoyim Hashvi Shabbos, Rashi doesn't even hint to them or indicate to them, not even with the Vagoimer, etc. Now, we possibly could have said that by quoting the first words Sheishes Yomim, what Rashi actually means to do is not just to bring and to translate these 2 words, but rather it is like a beginning for the whole pasuk. The Rebbe says we find in a number of places where Rashi will quote the beginning of a pasuk or the beginning of a topic, not even saying V'goimer, but what he's referring to is that whole pasuk or that whole topic, the whole concept. For example, on the pasuk V'asu es ha'ephod, they should make the ephod one of the begodim, of course, for the Kohen Gadol. Rashi says, Im basi lefarish, if I'm going to come along to try to explain how the ephod was made in each and every pasuk, clarifying what the pasuk means, is going to get very, very confusing. Therefore, Rashi says, I'm going to write out the whole pirush on the ephod right here, and then eventually show also how it fits into the psukim. Rashi goes ahead and explains all the details of the making of the ephod, of that whole section, of that whole parsha. Yet, which words did Rashi quote over there is only v'asu es ha'ephod, also not even saying v'goimer. So we can understand that Rashi could do sometimes this idea of just quoting the beginning of something where he means the whole thing that follows. Another example in Rashi, which also actually comes right after this pasuk, after Sheishes Yomim, on the pasuk Eila Moyadei Hashem Mikroi Kodesh Asher Tikru Oisam B'Moyadam. Now this seems to be a pasuk that's completely redundant, completely extra, because the pasuk just before Sheishes Yomim had already said that we're about to discuss the Yomim Tovim. So Rashi is about to explain why are the Yomim Tovim being discussed again. So Rashi also just quotes the words Eila Moyadei Hashem, doesn't say V'goimer, and he goes on to explain why it's all necessary. However, in our case, says the Rebbe, we cannot say that that's why Rashi is quoting the word Sheishes Yomim just to be the beginning of the whole topic. Why? Because Rashi doesn't suffice with just saying the very first word and just the very beginning of the idea. Only, in other words, when does Rashi do this? Only if that beginning would contain at least a bit of that which he wants to discuss and explain. So, for example, in the examples that we just mentioned, when Rashi says v'asu es ha'ephod, we understand Rashi doesn't just say the word v'asu, he says v'asu es ha'ephod, because that's everything he's going to be speaking about is the ephod. So too, when he quotes Eila Moyadei, we understand Rashi doesn't just say the word Eila, he says Eila Moyadei Hashem, because he's going to be discussing the Yomim Tovim. So we understand why he says those words. However, back to our case, Rashi wants to discuss why is Shabbos mentioned over here next to Yom Tov. Rashi is completely seemingly not discussing the Sheishes Yamim at all. So by saying Sheishes Yamim, the seemingly is completely irrelevant, even in a partial way, to the topic that Rashi wants to discuss, about Shabbos being close to Yom Tov. Another question that Rebbe has on Rashi. Why is it that Rashi goes in that order? He starts off with a negative. Anyone that is desecrating the Yomim Tovim is as if he desecrated the Shabbosim, etc. Why doesn't he start off with a positive? Whoever fulfills the Yomim Tovim, then it's as if he fulfilled the Yomim Tovim. And then if you want to add about desecrating, especially that in the Pasuk that's comparing them, it's actually referring to the keeping of Shabbos and Yom Tov. Now, even though you may come along and say that what Rashi is telling us in this particular order is taken directly from the Toras Koyanim, says the Rebbe. Number one, in the Toras Koyanim, according to our version of the Toras Koyanim is actually not specifically referring to these words in the Pasuk. In other words, the Toras Koyanim is speaking in general terms, why Shabbos is next to Yom Tov, and therefore it could make sense to say that we might start off with the negative and then follow with the positive. But again, Rashi is focusing specifically on the wording in our Pasuk, where here the Pasuk is clearly comparing them in the way of the positive, of keeping Shabbos and keeping Yom Tov. But in addition to all of that, it's known, as discussed many times, that Rashi in his explanation only quotes Maimori Razal with their words, only if that is somehow going to help understand Im Pshuti Shel Mikra. It's going to be necessary, those wordings. That's when Rashi is going to quote it and to say it in that particular way. Otherwise, Rashi doesn't necessarily quote the words of the sources where he's coming from. Now, seemingly, we might say the following. By comparing Yom Tov to Shabbos, the Pasuk primarily wants to tell us how important it is to keep Yom Tov and that we shouldn't be lenient and take it lightly, the idea of working on Yom Tov. We may come along and think that since the whole establishing the days of Yom Tov is dependent on Beis Din, of course, because they have to say when Rosh Chodesh is, we may think, since it's all based on Beis Din, so the Isur Malacha maybe is also not that strict. It's also all based on what man had figured out, etc. And therefore we may not be as strict with it. So the Torah wants to emphasize mainly and warn us, if you're going to desecrate Yom Tov, it's as if you desecrated the Shabbos, it's as if you desecrated Shabbos. And maybe that's why Rashi is starting with the most important point, to warn us, to desecrate Yom Tov is such a severe thing. And only then we also add the positive, that if you're going to keep Yom Tov, it'll be like keeping Shabbos. However, the Rebbe says that this answer is actually not sufficient. Because since the comparison of Yom Tov to Shabbos, again, in the Pasuk is emphasizing it, not by negating it, by speaking about desecrating Shabbos or Yom Tov, but rather, in the Pasuk, we're mainly focusing on the positive, on keeping Shabbos and Yom Tov. From there, we also learn out that the same thing would apply in the opposite of desecrating them. So again, Rashi, if he's explaining the Pasuk, he should have also started off with a positive, or at least either written only the positive, or at least do it in the order of the Pasuk, starting off with the positive and then going to the negative. To explain all of this, the Rebbe now tells us that Rashi's question is actually something else completely. When Rashi starts off with saying, Ma inyan Shabbos eitzel moyados, what's the connection between Shabbos and Yom Tov? This itself is not really such a question. In Pshuta Shel Mikra. That is, many Mefarshim actually answer this. When the Pasuk says, Eile moyadei Hashem, these are the appointed times, Shabbos could be included in that. Shabbos could also be considered a appointed time, a yoim moyed. So there's really no problem for Shabbos being in these psukim. It's also a day that's asur b'malacha, where you're not allowed to do work. Even if you want to say that Shabbos doesn't really fit in with the rest of the Yomim Tovim, moyadei Hashem asher tikru, nevertheless, you could say that the Pasuk is just mentioning along, together with the Yom Tovim, also mentioning in Shabbos, to be able to highlight that there's differences between Shabbos and Yom Tov. That Shabbos is not dependent on Beis Din, Yom Tov is dependent on Beis Din. Shabbos actually is called Shabbos Shabbosoin because you're not allowed to even do the kind of works that are related to preparing food, whereas Yom Tov you are. So we could understand that Shabbos would be mentioned together with Yom Tov. That itself is not really such a question at all. The question that Rashi is bothered by is how the Torah starts off discussing Shabbos, the introduction. You see, the Torah just started saying, these are the Yomim Tovim of Hashem, these are the festivals of Hashem. Then suddenly it says, Sheishes Yomim Teyasam Malacha, 6 days work should be done. Now, if we were speaking about in the first time the Torah tells us about Shabbos, we understand that it needs to be said, you work 6 days. The Torah is trying to tell us that Shabbos is going to be forbidden to do work, and therefore the Torah first needs to tell us, don't be worried of how you are going to earn a livelihood, because Sheishes Yomim Tavoid, you'll work for 6 days, Vasisa Kol Malachtecha, you'll do all your work, so that's taken care of. Some other points that Rebbe says, in the first time the Torah is telling us about Shabbos, that when it says Sheishes Yomim, it's in accordance to what the Pasuk continues and says over there, that why do we keep Shabbos? Because Hashem made the world in 6 days, rested on the 7th day, so we understand that the Torah tells us, we work for 6 days and rest on the 7th day. Another point we could say is that from Sheishes Yomim Tavd Vasisa Kol Malachtecha, Rashi actually tells us that we learn from there that when Shabbos comes, so for 6 days you were working, but when Shabbos comes it should be as if all your work has been completed, you're not concerned anymore about your work at all. The problem becomes over here in Parshas Emor, which is not the main place that the Torah is telling us about Shabbos. It's only being mentioned for the sake of the Yomim Tovim. Eila Moya de Hashem, these are the Yomim Tovim, and we mentioned Shabbos as well. So the question immediately becomes, why are we mentioning the Sheishes Yomim? Why are we introducing the Sheishes Yomim that there's a 6 days before the Shabbos? And how is that all related to the Yomim Tovim? Torah should have just started off with the words, by Yom HaShvi, Shabbos Shabbos, and we're trying to speak about special days that the Eibishter gave us. So it's not relevant over here about the 6 days at all. It's just to tell us, these are Yom Tovim, you have a Shabbos, you have a Yom Tov, and so on. It is this question that Rashi is answering by explaining to us what Chazal say, why Shabbos B'chlal fits with Yom Tov. To teach us about the idea of not desecrating Yom Tov, etc. In other words, just to clarify, just to make the point clear, the concept of Ma'inyan Shabbos Eitzel Moedis, this is a concept that the Chachamim teach us. It's Rashi is bringing this Maimer Chazal of the connection between Shabbos and Yom Tov to help us understand why the 6 days are brought before. In other words, why is Shabbos brought together with Yom Tov? To teach us about the strictness of not doing Malacha on Yom Tov, and to compare this to not doing work on Shabbos. Once we'll have that understood, we're then automatically going to understand why it was necessary to say the word Sheishes Yom Tiyasam Malacha. How does this work? How does this make sense? The explanation goes as follows. When we say Sheishes Yomim, we're not only referring to a sum total of 6 individual days. In other words, there's 1 day, 2 days, 3 days, there's 6 days, and then the 7th day is Shabbos, and so on. When it says the word Sheishes, we also refer to an entity of a group of 6 days. In other words, a unit. One group made up of 6 days. A certain type of Zman. As Rashi himself says a couple of psukim further, on the word Shivas, Rashi says every time it says the word Shivas, Shem Dovaru. It's a name of a unit, of a concept, of a collective, a collection of 7 days brought together. And Rashi says over there, the same thing is true with the word Shmoinas, the same thing is true with the word Sheishes. It means 1 6-day period, or 7-day period, or 8-day period. This is what our pasuk is telling us over here. When it says Sheishes Yomim Teyasam Malacha, 6 days work can be done, means that the Eibishter gave a special concept within time itself, a group of 6 days. That's a certain type, a certain kind of time. These are the kind of days where work is allowed to be done. And anything that is outside this kind of work day, which is usually a 6 days, but anything that's out of this group, out of this category of work days, of weekdays, usually is the regular 6 days of the week, are going to be asur b'malacha. And this now can help us understand why the Torah starts off by saying, in order to explain the strictness of Yom Tov, it says, Sheishes Yom Tayasa Malacha. With this, the Torah is trying to give us this idea that we have two general concepts within time in relation to work. We have the regular weekdays, work days, or referred to over here as Sheishes Yomim, days that are permitted in work. That's Tayasa Malacha, where work could be done. And then anything that's out of the category of weekdays, of the Sheishes Yomim, automatically is Asr B'Malacha. Once we understand that, then Shabbos and Yom Tov go right together. In other words, from this we understand that Kol HaMachala L'Samoyed is the moment you're going to desecrate Yom Tov, it's just like desecrating Shabbos. Even though, yes, it's true regarding the punishment and some other things that might not be exactly the same Isur of Malacha on Yom Tov and Shabbos, but generally speaking, the concept of doing Malacha on Yom Tov, since it's not part of that group of work days, of weekdays, is the same idea as Shabbos then. In other words, it's out of the weekday group and it's in the Shabbos group. And that's what Rashi is saying, Ke'ilu chilul es haShabbosos. According to this, says the Rebbe in Siva, we're going to understand why Rashi only brings the word Sheishes Yomim, he doesn't even add the word V'goymer. By emphasizing Sheishes Yomim, that Sheishes Yomim is a unit for itself, a category for itself. That's what Rashi is trying to tell us. And that the continuation of Vayoyim HaShvi, what it speaks now about that the seventh day of Shabbos, is not the seventh day as if this is another day following from the 6 days in the context of work. In other words, you have the 6 days of work and now you have another day. But we're trying to say that this is a completely different Geder of Zman. It's a completely different kind of time. This is a time now which is completely forbidden in work. And therefore, once we understood that there's Sheishes Yomim, and therefore, anyone that's going to desecrate Yom Tov is going to be like desecrating Shabbos. Rashi doesn't even add the words Teyasa Malacha. And the Rebbe says two reasons. Number one is because really, to do work, that's already an optional thing. When we speak about the concept of Sheishes Yomim, the main difference between the Sheishes Yomim and versus Shabbos and Yom Tov is about the idea of Isur Malacha. These are days that you're not allowed to do work at all. And it's not so relevant, the fact that it's not a matter of having to do work on the other days. It's an optional thing. You could do work. But the main thing over here is that it's Sheishes Yomim. Alternatively, the Rebbe says, you could also say that by saying Sheishes Yomim, Rashi is referring to the general idea of Sheishes Yomim. In other words, including also the work that's going to be done, similar to what we said before by V'asu Asa Ephod. But again, Sheishes Yomim is not referring to the whole concept of Shabbos that's going to be mentioned later. The maximum it would be referring to is to this first group, Sheishes Yomim, these 6 days where work can be done. But really, the whole idea is that then comes Shabbos, and that's a completely different thing. Says the Rebbe, now we'll also understand the order of Rashi, why it says first, Kol HaMachal, whoever desecrates Shabbos. And then it says whoever fulfills Shabbos, since the whole point of comparing Yom Tov to Shabbos over here is being learned from this separation of these two categories that we have Sheishes Yomim, a group of 6 days. So in other words, the whole limud, the whole thing is coming to teach us about desecrating Yom Tov. In other words, someone that desecrates Yom Tov by doing work, which with this, he is actually being over on that separation of the Sheishes Yomim. In other words, 6 days you were allowed to do work, and suddenly you removed yourself from that. You went into the time which is not allowed to do work. It's out of those Sheishes Yomim. Automatically then, it's as if you were Machal Shabbos. From there, we'll also understand in the opposite way that Machlal Lav Atashemei, and from the negative, we'll also understand the positive. And anyone that fulfills the days of Yom Tov will also be as if he fulfilled Shabbos. The Rebbe says from Yeina Shal Torah, from the wine of Torah, from the Pnimius of Torah that we have in this Rashi. It's known what the Chazal tell us. Sheishes Yomim Tavit, Chazal say it's actually a mitzvah. It's a mitzvah saseh. That means to do work on the 6 days is not only something that you're allowed to do al pi Torah, but it's a mitzvah. It's a derech in Torah, al pi Torah. It's a way in avodas Hashem of a Yid. As it's known that there needs to be the concept of b'chol asher ta'as, so we get involved, we make a keli, we make a vessel in the ways of nature, and then Hashem's bracha comes. On the other hand, this idea of acting in this way is only necessarily because of our gashmi the keguf. The gashmi the keguf of a Yid. In other words, because of our neshama being clothed in our physical body, because of the concealments of the body, so al pi Torah we need to act in the way of teva. Like Chazal tell us, Ein soimchen ala nes, you can't rely on miracles. Dina de malchus adina, we have to follow the laws of the government, etc. But as far as the neshama of the Yid is concerned, not only isn't there any necessity that he should need to do work, on the contrary, he shouldn't have to do work at all. Because since the neshama is completely not within the realm of the body and its nature, the neshama, as a famous Sicha that the Rebbe Friedrich Rebbe said, the Rebbe Rashab, that the neshama never went into galus. It always remains higher than the concealments of the world. It's always like standing in front of the king, in front of Hashem. From the perspective of the neshama's level, doing any sort of work is always like making a movement in front of the king, which is inappropriate. Says the Rebbe, this would be similar to, we know there's a concept that we say that alavai, a person will be davening all day long. And what happens if a person is davening? If he's davening all day long, he wouldn't be allowed to do any sort of work. He wouldn't even be able to make a motion, and that would apply all day long. That's the state that the neshama is in. Therefore, as far as the neshama is concerned, there should be tishbois. We shouldn't be involved in work. So here are the two extremes that is needed in the avodah of the Yid. On the one hand, we say there's the Sheishis Yom, the 6 days, where Al Pi Torah, he is involved with the matters of the guf. He is involved in working, and that's a mitzvah saseh. But on the days of Shabbos and Yom Tov, when by a Yid's neshama is shining, there he needs to be standing completely removed from the body, from all of the matters of the body, from his nature, and automatically you'll be understood that then the whole concept of work is out of the question. So this is similar to the two ideas we said before. There's the Sheishis Yom where work is the norm, but then anything out of that, that's already neshama life. That's already spiritual life where there's no room for work. Says the Rebbe, since the neshama is completely higher than guf and galus, this also ultimately affects even the guf, that notwithstanding the fact that the guf currently is in the limitations and the galus, nevertheless it should shine inside of him the strength of the neshama, which is higher than limitations, which is higher than galus, till eventually we get the guf also out of the galus in the literal sense by the geula ha'amitis v'hashleima through Mashiach Tzidkeinu b'karev mamash.